Thank you, Peter, for joining us. You've brought out a very interesting report called Shifting Geography of Global Value Chains and the Implications for Developing Countries and Trade Policy. Talk to us about what the most important recommendations are of this report. Just locate what it is that you are saying essentially.
Well, essentially it's about an approach to trade policy in its broadest sense. And reduced to its essence, it's really a recommendation to reduce transactions costs, costs for conducting business, but connecting that to international trade. So, for example, if you want to shift goods around the world, you need to reduce tariffs, you need to reduce the costs of transportation, the costs of logistics, and so on and so forth. And the reason that's important is because of the nature of global value chains. If one thinks, for example, of a car, it's not obvious where cars are from. You can say you bought a German car, it's built by a German company, but the parts and components are sourced from all across the world. And a country like South Africa typically plays a relatively small role in the total composition of the final product that we call the car. So if you want to produce those goods optimally at the cheapest possible price, you need to reduce transactions costs across the board. And so we explore that from a number of angles, from the World Trade Organization to, if you like, the Nike strategy or the unilateral strategy, just do it, so what governments do in their own right, to preferential trade arrangements or regional trade arrangements.
I had a discussion with the Minister for Economic Development, South African Minister for Economic Development, Ibrahim Patel, recently, and he was very bolshy about the fact that industrial policy was back on the agenda as a tool to help governments, plan economic development and growth. How does one locate, industrial policy in the kind of changing global environment and the kind of, new rules that one needs to begin to formulate to be able to compete effectively? I mean, is there a space for industrial policy still?
Well, I think one has to define terms, so it depends what you mean by industrial policy. What I've just described, I would in some senses consider to be a kind of industrial policy. Actually, trade and industrial policy are flip sides of the same coin, really. So the way I like to think about it is in terms of horizontal policy measures. So policy measures that affect all business in the country, like, for instance, infrastructure costs. So if you reduce the cost of infrastructure, that's good for industry in general, and it affects everybody. And I would consider that to be an industrial policy of sorts. Education could be another example, customs processes, technology policy, and so on and so forth. Then there is the vertical toolkit, which really targets specific sectors of the economy. And so I suspect that what Mr. Patel and Dr. Davies have in mind when they talk about industrial policy is more the vertical, in other words, picking winners, than the horizontal measures, even though they are doing those as well, the heavy emphasis on infrastructure spend, for example. Personally, I'm skeptical about the picking winners approach for all sorts of reasons, which we can get into. So in the report, we emphasize much more the horizontal space.
In terms of the report, you are suggesting that existing or current World Trade Organization rules are simply not keeping track with, a changing global environment in terms of value chain. Tell me, how is it lagging behind, and what are the changes that we need to bring in? I'll come back to how it will affect, country-to-country relations, and then, of course, also, blocks of arrangements or preferential trade agreements.
Very difficult to summarize in a couple of minutes, but essentially one could say that the current trade negotiation and the rules architecture on which it is based, so the Doha round of trade negotiations, is based on yesterday's understanding of trade policy, and the rules reflect that. So I spoke about the world of global value chains in which goods are constantly shifting across borders. That requires an open investment environment, but it also requires rules that govern the conduct of investment. In the World Trade Organization, there really are no rules that govern the conduct of investment, no multilateral rules. So that is one example of a huge gap in the rules architecture. And there are others. For example, we're talking about manufacturing value chains at the moment, but in the report we also look at services value chains. If one thinks of the business process outsourcing chain, for example. There's a services value chain, but services are very incompletely covered in the WTO rules framework as well. So there are large areas of gaps in the WTO's rules architecture that in time need to be addressed. And that's a classic problem in trade negotiations, that in a sense the negotiators are always trying to keep up with the actual conduct of business. So the negotiations typically are about yesterday's business, not today's or tomorrow's for that matter.
So how do we bridge that gap? How do we adapt the very contested rules that are always under discussion at levels of the WTO with those dynamic changes that are constantly happening? And for example, what are, in terms of the findings of the reports, what are the immediate implications for country-to-country agreements?
It's a very challenging question, and there are no simple answers. But ultimately, if you want to change the rules, you have to negotiate them. And essentially, that means a large-scale trade negotiation, such as we have with the Doha round.
Yeah.
And as we know,
but the Doha round has been so plagued by disagreements. How are we going to introduce an entirely new set of conditions, if you like?
Yeah, so I was getting to that. So the problem is that the Doha round is too broadly conceived. It covers everything and nothing because it's not succeeding as a result. So in another report, a previous report of the Forum's Trade Council, we looked at the issue of plurilateral negotiations.
Those are smaller groups of countries, I suppose.
Exactly, yeah. So smaller groups of like-minded countries coming together to negotiate rules of common interest. This is, we think, the only way to move the system forward into the future. The challenge is the politics of it, because obviously that has the potential to exclude whole groups of countries, or as what happened in the Uruguay round, the previous large round of multilateral trade negotiations, where plurilateral negotiations negotiated in previous rounds were effectively brought into the Uruguay round and locked in. And many developing countries complained about that.
Yes.
So how you address those challenges is a big subject, and the subject of our previous report, or in fact 2 reports previously, where we looked at this in some detail. But the bottom line is there's no simple answers to that question, but you need a kind of framework of principles to guide such a negotiation.
What would those principles include?
Things like, for instance, if a small country, a poor country, wants to join the negotiation, if it sees an interest in it, it should be provided with the means to do so. In other words, what is called in WTO talk an aid for trade agenda. So you would support the negotiators financially, you would also support the implementation of the outcomes. That would be one. The other would be that if you're not part of the negotiation, you're not forced to implement the results, and that's very clear up front. And the third would be you need some sort of compact to allow such negotiations to proceed in the first place. And so those countries that want to just stall the process should not be allowed to do so once they've agreed on that compact. Those are just some examples of the kinds of recommendations we made in that report.
Now, World Trade Organization talks have always been dominated by, countries resenting what they call deep-seated inequalities, for example, that, the developed world has a set or a regime rather that benefits its, own interests, whilst the South is always coming in and kind of almost asking for a rearrangement, but from a position of weakness. How does these changing conditions, as you identify them in that report, how do we, and the recommendations that you come up with, how do you prevent those recommendations from entrenching skewed trade patterns and for allowing for more equitable, trade relations between richer and poorer countries? I mean, is that even possible?
It's a great question, and there are no simple answers to that question. But I would say a couple of things. The first is that the world of global value chains is evolving almost spontaneously, as it were, irrespective of what happens in the World Trade Organization. And even though many countries in East Asia, for instance, not so much the now developed countries, but if one thinks back 20 years, these were not developed countries by any stretch of the imagination.
We're talking about Brazil, India, these countries.
Sure. Nonetheless, these
Mexico.
countries have managed to succeed in their development trajectories despite the rules. If one thinks of Brazil, for instance, a good example of that, its major export is agriculture. this is the most distorted area
Yes.
of international trade. So the point being, it's possible to succeed in spite of the rules. It really matters what you do domestically.
But the rules does matter, don't they?
It does, absolutely, yeah. So essentially what we're identifying in the report, the shifting geography of global value chains, is that at the moment China is at the center of these value chains, but the China cost is rising. And so that creates opportunities for countries like Vietnam, like Bangladesh, and the final frontier, if you like, potentially Africa, to get in on the bottom rung of the ladder of these value chains. And we want the rules to enable that process, essentially. And then what that creates, or entrenches really, is a pattern of growing South-South trade. A lot of it driven by these global value chains, multinational companies, not just from the developed world, but increasingly from the developing world, which are also getting into these games. And so one of the things we're concerned about is that the old trade negotiations, the Doha round, if you like, are predicated on a north-south negotiating dynamic, whereas increasingly the actual conduct of trade and investment is south-south in nature.
Now, just in terms of, look at Africa quickly, a lot of economies, extraction-based economies. How do you create value? How's the value chain? How does it work in African conditions?
I guess one should distinguish between the potential for regional value chains. If one thinks of the role that South Africa plays in Southern Africa, for instance, we have our own mini multinationals, if you like, that do interact in the region, and insertion into global value chains. So at the moment, in a sense, African countries are inserted into those global value chains, but by exporting commodities. And so the key question is, can we get them into manufacturing? And the problem is, it's not going to be all African countries. It's going to be a few, and it's going to be those that are relatively well endowed to do so, but also relatively well governed. Which those will be is anybody's guess, I think, at this stage. And probably we're looking at a 10 to 15 year time horizon before that really starts to take off.